Hello, friends, and welcome to a Chabura public shiur. Tonight we have with us, for the first time, Miriam, Zami, Edeson, and together we will be exploring how to read Midrash, today diving into the narrative of Korach. About our speaker, Miriam Zami Edeson is a PhD candidate at Yeshiva University in Talmud and Ancient Judaism. Miriam teaches widely across academic and communal settings and is a member of the Sefaria Word by Word Fellowship. She has previously published at the Lair House, where she was also an editor, and writes on Midrash and meaning at her Substack. It is a privilege and honor to have Miriam with us for the very first time, hopefully many more times going forward. Thank you everyone for being here live. Thank you everyone who's going to be listening afterwards. Miriam, the floor is yours.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I am excited to be here. What I want to do today, this afternoon, tonight, wherever you're zooming in from, I want to explore some Midrashim about Korach, in honor of this week's parasha. I am somebody who grew up very much attuned to the pesha of the text. My grandfather, Rabbi Moshe Shama, wrote an amazing commentary we're calling The Covenant, which really explores the peshat of Chumash and of the parasha. And I take that very seriously. And I actually, in my academic studies, have focused a little bit more on rabbinic literature and actually trying to apply some of the same tools and literary techniques that we use in understanding peshat, applying that to Midrash as well. So that's what I try to do. I think that, I can speak for myself. We grow up with a sense of Midrash, that it's fanciful and far-fetched and a little confusing, and are the sages making stuff up? And what I try to do is explore what the rabbis are actually saying, where are they getting it from, what are the messages inherent in the text, and where in the text itself, right? Where in the actual text of the Chumash are they trying to draw their ideas from? So what we'll do, instead of doing a methodological class, what I wanted to do is focus on Korach itself, and the Midrashim about Korach, and use that as a way to investigate some of these methodological questions. And you are welcome to participate. Please just, I might not see everybody, so you can use the raise hand feature on Zoom, or just, call out. That's fine. We'll speak. I'll speak for around like 45 minutes or so, and then at the end we'll have some more time for discussion, if that sounds good. I will share my screen throughout, but I can also put the source sheet in the chat if that is helpful to people. So let me just do that. Okay. All right, so it's in the chat. What I want to start off with, actually, it's not on the source sheet. I would like to actually start off with the beginning of the parasha this week, and try to, first of all, just figure out, why do Midrashim, why are they even necessary? Why do they even come up at all when we read the text? So what I want to do is just share my screen. Actually, if you have a Chumash in front of you, you could follow along on a Chumash. I'm going to put on the Sefaria website. We'll read some of the Pesukim, and I want us to start thinking, where might the rabbinic Midrashim try to come fill in some gaps? So I'll share my screen, and let me just, okay, so everybody sees Sefaria. You're welcome to pull it up on your own, but I have it over here. Okay, so we start off by Kach Korach ben Yitzhak ben Kehat ben Levi v'Datan v'Aviram b'nei Eliyav ve'on ben Pelet u'b'nei Reuven. And Korach, the son of Yitzhak, son of Kohat, son of Levi, took something, and also Datan and Aviram, the sons of Eliab, and also On ben Pelet, the sons of Reuven. Okay. Next pasuk. ויקומו לפני משה ואנשים מבני ישראל 50 ו200 נשיאי עדה קריאי מועד אנשי שם. And they rose up, they stood up against Moshe, together 250 people, nisi'ei eda, kind of like chieftains of the community, right? The English says, chosen in the assembly, anshe shem, meaning people with a reputation, people with a name, people who are significant. Okay, so far, just in these first two Pesukim, what might be confusing? What might be some sort of an inconsistency or an incongruity or a textual gap in the Chumash that we have? You're welcome to suggest something.
What did he take?
Good, right? Okay, this is not even a trick question. This is a very famous question, right? What did Korach take? Vayikach Korach, right? What? There's no object. There's a verb without an object, and he takes something. There's, we might suggest that perhaps Korach is taking the other people, right? There are ways to solve this within the Peshat itself. The Midrash is going to try to come to fill in that gap. Okay, great. Any other ideas so far? Then it continues, ויקהלו על משה ועל אהרון ויאמרו עליהם רב לכם כי כל העדה כולם קדושים ובתוכם אדוני ומדוע תתנשאו על קהל אדוני. Right? They congregate upon Moshe and Aharon, and they say to them, it is too much. You have gone too far. It's too much, because all of the community, kol ha'edah, are holy. Everybody is kedoshim, and God is within their midst. So why do you raise yourselves above the Lord's congregation? Interesting complaint against Moshe. And now we know, and I'm not going to read the rest of it, we know what happens after that, right? Moshe sort of devises a test to test out who's really kadosh, who's really chosen by God. And there's even a back and forth between Moshe after suggesting this test. He then goes back to Korach and he tries to even speak with him, right? In verses 8 and 9, Moshe says, "Hame'at mikem ki hivdil Elohei Yisrael etchem me'adat Yisrael," right? God has separated you, has set you apart from the community. You are special. What are you complaining about? And I'm going to stop my screen share. Many commentators have talked about this entire chapter, because if you read it fully in the Peshat, it actually reads a little bit confusingly. There's a few different complaints happening. There's Korach and his congregation. There's Datan and Abiram. Then there's 250 chieftains. And we don't know if they're all part of the same rebellion, the same complaint, or do they all have their own issues that they're trying to work out. Many of the commentators suggest, right, that they each had, separate complaints, but they kind of are joined together by the text, or maybe themselves joined together, because insurrection loves company, right? So we find other people who have who are unhappy with the situation and with the status quo, even if they don't necessarily agree. If you read later on in the chapter, Datan and Abiram's complaint is very different from Korach. Datan and Abiram are not complaining, that we are also holy. They just don't want to be in the desert. So it's a little bit of a different complaint. So we have a whole bunch, and the chapter reads it goes back and forth between Moshe trying to appease Korach, trying to speak to Datan and Abiram, trying to do this situation with the Ketoret. It really flips back and forth, and you need to read it carefully in the Peshat itself to understand really what's happening. The Midrash is aware of all of this, right? The rabbis, one of my main points always is that the rabbis are very close readers of the text. They know what the text says. They know what the Peshat says. They know that it's flipping back and forth between different scenes, between different ideas. And when it develops a persona, it has that in mind. So with that, I want to now shift gears and look at the Midrashim about Korach. As far as we know from the Peshat, Korach is from the Levite tribe, right? And his main complaint is that Kulam Kedoshim, everybody is holy. Why do you only have the power? Based on that, before we even look at the Midrashim, how would you characterize Korach? What is he trying to get at? What do you think is his major complaint? And on the flip side, what would make him happy? What would he like Moshe to respond to him? Any ideas? Okay. I see a lot of names and not a lot of faces. So I think that based on the Peshat, it seems that Korach really wants kind of the way that the commentators describe it, sort of a democratized sense of holiness. Okay, so some people, right, what leading role, he wants power. The rabbis are going to continue on this thread of maybe Korach is not really in it for all the people, and maybe he just sort of wants power for himself. So let's take a look at some of these texts. You can either follow along on my screen, or you can look at the what I put in the chat. Okay, I am going to I will read and translate, and then we can talk about it as we go along. So first, we're reading from the Midrash Tanhuma. We're going to see later that there's a lot of parallels. The rabbinic literature across various forms are really interested in the story of Korach, and we're going to ask why that is. Why are they so interested? And not just in Korach, by the way. If we have time, we'll get to the sons of Korach as well, which you might already have a suspicion why they might be interested in the sons of Korach. Okay, so first, Midrash Tanhuma. ויקח קורח. מה כתיב למעלה מן העניין? דבר אל בני ישראל ואמרת עליהם ועשו להם ציצית. Right, we just read in last week's parasha, just ended with the commandment to make tzitzit. קפץ קורח ואמר למשה, אתה עומד ונתנו על ציצית וגומר, טלית שכולה תכלת, מה היא שיהיה פטורה מן הציצית? אמר לו משה, חייבת בציצית. This is a famous midrash. It's brought down by Rashi also, which is usually how students become familiar with different midrashim. So we just learned about tzitzit, right? And the midrash is taking it chronologically, and it says, right, Korach interrupts Moshe giving the laws about tzitzit, and he says, okay, a talit that is created totally, right? We have the commandment to have one fringe of techelet according to the Torah. A talit that is totally made out of techelet, out of the blue wool, would it be exempt from tzitzit? And what does Moshe say? No, it is still obligated, right? It is still obligated in tzitzit. You still need to have the techelet. Amar lo Korach, talit shekulat techelet ena poteret atzma ve'arba'a chutin poteret ota. Right? Oh, but a talit that is entirely techelet doesn't exempt it from the mitzvah. However, 4 little strings exempt it. Right? And then he goes on. Bait male sefarim, mahu shetehe petura min hamezuzah. Amar lo chayevet b'mezuzah. A house filled with Torah scrolls, right? Would it be exempt from mezuzah, from requiring a mezuzah? And Moshe responds, no, it is obligated in mezuzah. אמר לו, כל התורה כולה 275 פרשיות שיש בה, כולן אין פותרות את הבית, ושני פרשיות שבמזוזה פותרות את הבית. Right? The entire Torah, with all of its 275 paragraphs, which is not entirely clear what that's referring to, these 275 paragraphs. One scholar suggests that this is really a corruption. It should be 175 paragraphs, and that would correspond to the triennial cycle that the land of Israel, that the rabbis in the land of Israel were following, where they would finish the whole Torah in 3 years, and it ended up being 175. But it's still not entirely clear. It could also be that they're talking about literally like the parashiyot, not like our, the actual paragraphs of Torah, parashiyot petuchot. So they do not exempt the house, but one paragraph that's in mezuzah exempts the whole house, right? That doesn't make any logical sense, Moshe. אמר לו דברים אלו לא נצטווית עליהם ומליבך אתה בודעם. הדה הוא דכתיב ויקח קורח. ויקח קורח אין ויקח אלא לשון פליגה שליבו לקחו כעניין שנאמר מה יקחך ליבך ומה ירזמון עיניך. Right? So what does Korach decide from this conversation with Moshe? He says, no, you are not, you are creating these mitzvot yourself. You're making them up, these laws. There is no basis for them. And then the Midrash continues, and this is why it says, Vayikach Korach, Korach took, because that is an expression of division, and it quotes from Eov, right? That your heart is taking you in a certain way. This is Eov, Eov's friend speaking to him, right? Your heart is taking you away from God, so the heart could be pulled in different directions, and that is what is happening to Korach. Okay, before we continue, right? What is the nature of Korach's questions over here? If anybody has any suggestions, right? How would we characterize what Korach is interested in, what he's asking through his questions? And how might that relate to what we know from the actual text?
probably touching on the kulam kiddushim. So if the entire beged is techelet, then why one? Why do we need you, Moshe, or one techelet?
Good, right? Exactly. The Midrash is using it really as a metaphor to say that, like he thinks that the entire nation is kadosh, we don't really need leadership. Like everybody is holy. We don't actually need any kind of hierarchy. We don't need leaders. Same thing with the techelet, and Moshe's response is, "No, you still need it." That is really parallel to his complaint in the text. Other ideas? What are the what might the rabbis and the midrash be vocalizing through these questions?
Could it also be that
Sam, it's very difficult to hear you.
I'm sorry.
Hopefully,
You can
Sam
write
will.
it in the chat if you can. Okay, other ideas, questions?
Well,
These are questions. Yeah, go ahead.
This is Naomi. You said, like, what type of question is it? In a way, since it seems like a rhetorical question, like really what he's maybe saying is trying to draw attention to his main point without really outright saying it.
Right. These are rhetorical questions. It seems like Korach he's not actually interested in a real answer. It is interesting, though, because these questions actually feel quite rabbinic. You can imagine such a question arising in the actual rabbinic discussions. What do we do with the Talit Shekula Tachelet? Actually, by the way, it actually exists in the Gemara. We'll come to that in a minute. But the rabbis do engage with it in a real halachic way. So Korach is using probably what could be a real rabbinic question, a real halachic question, but he's using it in a bit of a rhetorical way, and the Midrash is using it in a satirical form, really, to criticize Korach. So now he takes it to the next level, right? The sages say, right? Amru Chachamim Zechronam Livracha, Chacham Gadol Haya Korach. Korach was actually a great sage. Why are the rabbis rabbinicizing Korach? Okay, keep that in mind. And he was one of the bearers of the Aron of the Ark. Right? In Bemidbar, when it talks about the wagons that are given to the Leviim, that they had the sacred service, meaning to carry the Aron. And Korach is the son, right, is the grandson of Kehat. Right, previously what we learned when Moshe said about the fringes of the techelet, he immediately made 250 techelet garments. ונתעטפו בהן אותן 50-200 איש, ראשי סנהדראות שקמו על משה, כעניין שנאמר, ויקומו לפני משה ואנשים מבני ישראל 50-200. ומהם נשיאי עדה, קליעי מועד, אנשי שם. Right? What does he do? He creates 250 fully techelet taletot, and they all wear them in front of Moshe. עמד קורח ועשה להם משתה, ונתעטפו כולן בטלטות תכלת ובאו בני אהרון ליטול מתנותיהן חזה ושוק הימין. Right? So Korach makes an entire feast for them. They wrap themselves in their techelet garments. Aaron's sons come to take their priestly gifts, their food, their sacrificial food. And amdu kenegdan va'amru lahem mitziva etchem litokach. They asked Korach's people, who allowed you to do this? Lo Moshe, lo natan lachem klum, shelo daber imo hamakom mizeh. So what do they say? They say Moses didn't allow you, Moshe didn't allow you to do this. God did not allow this. And they went and informed Moshe. Moshe went to try to placate them, right? And that I think is trying to reconcile the entire back and forth in the chapter that we touched on, that first Moshe speaks to them, then he leaves, and Moshe comes back. It seems like the Midrash is painting a larger picture about this back and forth between Moshe and Korach. Okay, So not only does Korach ask rhetorical questions about this fully techelet telet, he even has them all wear them. This seems, how do you understand this for the Midrash? Why does the Midrash paint this picture of everybody wearing these talitot?
Almost like the clothing of the Kohanim, meaning it's like taking their position as the new Kohen.
Oh, that's really interesting, right? It's an alternative to the bigdei kehuna, almost to the clothing of the priest. Right, that's really interesting. They're taking it, Moshe. It's like Korach already had this conversation. Moshe said no, like that's not, it's not what we do. And it's representing, goes back to the original kulam kedoshim, right? We are all holy. We are all a techelet. We are all techelet taletot. And that is that, and Korach is really it becomes very performative in a sense, and I think we are familiar with these kinds of behaviors, right, of performativity in trying to exert righteousness, right? It is not really true. Korach is not interested in truth. He is interested in performative activism, right? A word today. Okay, this is our main midrash. This gets quoted by Rashi, right? And actually, I want to read one more midrash, which is almost identical, but it's an earlier version of this midrash. So often what we need to do, right, to go back to our methodological questions, when we encounter a midrash, it's always important to find its parallels and to find its first appearance. And I think that the first appearance comes in the Yerushalmi. This is written in the land of Israel, of course, probably within the first 5 centuries or so, probably finished around the 5th century CE. So this is likely the first time that we hear about this midrash. Now, in the Tanhuma, where we read previously, that midrash is just, it's attached to the section about Korach. In the Yerushalmi, it's actually part of chapter 10 of Sanhedrin, which tells of those who have chelek be'olam haba, except for, right, it's like everybody has, all of Israel has a part in the world to come, except for here's a gigantic list of people who don't have a chelek in the world to come. And one of those people who don't have a portion in the world to come are apikorsim. Epicureans. It's a Greek word. I mean, it comes from Epicurean. It's not entirely clear what that means in Apicorus. So now we're having that conversation about the Apicorsim. Rav Amar, Korach Apikorsi Haya. Korach was an Epicurean. I don't think it's quite a few millennia before Epicurus existed. But the rabbis say that he was an Epicurean. If they weren't referring to the actual Greek philosophical school, they're referring to the manner of rejecting certain principles of Torah. So what did he do? Right? Exactly what we read before. He made this translation uses the word togas, right? He made garments, he made talitot that are fully techelet. He comes to Moshe and he asks them, and he asks him, and this changes the order a little bit. Right, he comes to Moshe and he asks him, "What's the law? Does a techelet that is fully blue, does a talit that is fully techelet need tzitzit?" And he says, "Yes." Right, and then he continues with the other questions that we already read. Right, a house full of Torah books, Torah scrolls. Does it need mezuzah? And he says yes. And then the Yerushalmi has an extra question that is not in the Tanhuma. So let's read it over here. Amar lo, here, this is where I am. Amar lo, baheret pegarit mahu, amar lo tameh. Right? He asks him, what is the rule for, now we're talking about the leprosy, right? This is in Vayikra, the portion that people tend to tune out a little bit, right? So this is the white spot, the size of a bean, right? What's the law with that? He says it's impure. And then he says, okay, but what if it's parcha bekula? It's spread across his entire body. He answers him, it is pure, it is tahor. This is straight out of Vayikra, by the way, this law. It talks about that. באותה שעה אמר קורח אין תורה מן השמיים ולא משה נביא אמת ולא אהרון כהן גדול. Right? at that moment, Korach, not only in the previous text that we looked at, right? Korach says, you're just making this stuff up. Now Korach is a little bit stronger over here. He says, Moshe is not a Navi Emet. He is not a true prophet. Aharon is not a real Kohen Gadol, right? And Torah is not Mina Shamayim. Torah is not from heaven. These are some pretty strong accusations against Moshe. I'm going to pause right here and think of some of the major differences. Why does the Yerushalmi contain this extra question about the Baheret Hikaris, this sort of question about purity and impurity, about leprosy, and that doesn't get quoted by the Tanhuma? Any suggestions? Yeah, Daniel.
Well, the whole discussion is about, taking over the priesthood and their functions. So it seems like a relevant question in that context.
Right. So that's a really interesting point. If we're talking about the priesthood, and again, to Ohad's point about the big day kahuna, perhaps, like they're trying to compete with, right? There's a sense that this is my domain also. I can be in charge of purity and impurity. Great, yeah. Other ideas?
When was the Tanhuma written? Maybe it's after the Bet Midrash was destroyed, so maybe it wasn't relevant to them.
Good. The Tanhuma is much later than the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi is also, by the way, after the temple is destroyed. But as we know, the Gemara is very interested in purity and impurity laws, which keep in mind, because after we finish this, I want to think more broadly about the questions that the Midrash envisions. So these are interesting questions, again, that actually feel pretty rabbinic. They don't actually feel out of total left field. You can imagine a rabbi asking such a question in the Gemara. Now let's continue, right? I'm going to skip down a little bit. Okay, so I'll summarize over here, right? Amar Moshe, right? In that moment, Moshe says, essentially to open the mouth of the earth to swallow them up. And everything, right, the rabbis say everything goes down with them, all their material wealth, if they were holding a pen, it went down with them also. And now over here, I'm reading over here. Who prays for them? Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman Amar, Moshe nitpalel alehem, yechi Reuven ve'al yamot. Right, Moshe prays for them, Reuven shall live and not die. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi Amar, Chana nitpalela alehem. He da'ated Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, ta'amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, b'shem Rabbi Yosef, כך הייתה עדתו של קורח שוקעת ויורדת עד שעמדה חנה ונתפללה עליהם ואמרה, אדוני ממית ומחיה מוריד שאול ויעל. Right? What do they say? Who prayed for them? First of all, the assumption is that somebody prayed for them. Why is that? We'll think about that in a second. The first option is that Moshe prayed for them, because later he's gonna say Yechi Reuven ve'al yamot, right? And Reuven should live and not die. And then the second opinion is that Hannah prayed for them. Hannah seems to come out of left field, right? Hannah says, and this is in accordance with the opinion of this rabbi who says that they were sinking, Korach's people were sinking in the ground until Hannah stood up, meaning for all these hundreds of years until Hannah is praying, until Hannah stood up and said in her prayer, right? Hashem sends down into the pit and lifts, right? Into Sheol, into the under the ground, under the earth, right? And lifts. And this is talking about Korach and his people. This is a very interesting addition to this midrash. We didn't have this previously, right? It's very unusual. Any suggestions? First of all, like why do they need to be prayed for? And where does Chana come from?
Maybe like prayers, who can then come and sort of find the positive in that character trait and sort of provide a justification for like a context that it could work in.
So say more. What do you mean? A context? Why do they need that?
Meaning like a corollary character that we see that they have the same character traits and can take it to the good. So, for example, Korach has this wants so badly to be part of the elite of the service of the people, and then you have Hannah who's willing to give up her son, even though he's not part of it, to the service.
Wow, that's very beautiful. And on the one hand, right, that represents a foil character, right? Like she represents sort of the better side of this. On the other hand, the Midrash presents that Korach's people sort of get redeemed eventually. Somebody's going to pray for them. Either it's Moshe, maybe it's Hanan a few hundred years, but there is some sort of redemption that happens to Korach and his people. The rabbis, the Midrashim, and this appears again and again, feel very committed to the notion that the sons of Korach and the descendants of Korach are redeemed. Any idea why that might be? Yeah, Daniel.
Well, there are, of course, the Mizmorim that are attributed to Bnei Korach, and also I think in Divrei Hayamim, where it says that Shemuel Hanavi was also one of Korach's descendants.
Amazing, right? First of all, the most important is that we have all of these Mizmoret Tehillim that are appended to and attributed to the sons of Korach. And, the Bible scholars take that in one direction about who these, Levim are who are singing these hymns, but the Midrashim take it in another direction. Oh, it must be that the sons of Korah did teshuvah. And how did that happen? And so we'll come to that in a couple of minutes. And you're correct also about the Divrei Hayamim. But first, before we get further into that,
in the Torah, Bnei Korach lo metu.
Good, right? And there's the quote, right? And not quote, there's later in a few chapters in Bamidbar, there's this famous line, Bnei Korach lo metu, and the rabbis take that to mean that they literally did not die. But we'll look at that in context. Yes, great point. Now, these two Midrashim present Korach as asking these sort of wise guy questions, maybe rhetorical, but actually in its character, pretty rabbinic questions. And I'd like to suggest that what the rabbis do in presenting characters asking questions is often voice their own questions. And I think that Korach is a good example of that. In the text, he asks a question that is actually not so crazy, right? We are all holy. God told us that we are a nation. We are a holy nation. So what is with this leadership class? Now, the rabbis, I think, are underscoring that question. On the one hand, they show Korach to be somebody who's not really interested in the truth. However, on the other hand, they're also expressing their own questions about the authority of Torah Sheba'al Peh. A lot of these laws, right, rely on the tradition, the oral tradition of Torah from Moshe, right, through the rabbis. And this is something that comes up again and again, especially in Agadah. Agadah, Midrash, the narrative portions of rabbinic literature is the place where the rabbis voice their kind of concerns and anxieties about all the stuff that they do in the halachic sections. So think about, let's say, the Agadah of Moshe in the Bet Midrash, in the academy of Rabbi Akiva, right? And Moshe is like, wow, I don't know anything that he's teaching. Well, what is all this? And God tells him, it's halacha ala Moshe misinai, right? These are laws that are from you. The rabbis are expressing there too, wow, there's a continuation of law that Moshe might not have even envisioned. And I would add that in the Yerushalmi, we have this extra question about the purity laws. I think that the purity area specifically for the rabbis becomes very, very developed. And this is an area that is sort of it doesn't correspond to any sort of objective reality, right? And the rabbis are very aware of that. Purity and impurity is about a state of being. It's a nominal state. It's about the rabbis declaring something pure or impure, or the priest declaring something. And the rabbis often express a lot of anxiety over that. There's no real correspondence to some sort of objective reality. So think of the famous story, the oven of Achnai, right? Tanuro shel Achnai. That's all about purity also, and they're debating over it. And we need the help of God to tell us the answer, and even that gets rejected, right? Purity laws in particular are an avenue for the rabbis to argue over the extent of law. How far can law go? How much are we able to add to the law where it's not what we would have originally envisioned? And I think that they're voicing some of those concerns in Korach too. Korach becomes a rabbinicized figure. He might not have the best intentions, right? But his questions contain a little bit of truth to them. What do we do with these weird on the margins cases that might not seem to be rooted in the text? Any comments or questions? I want to underscore this by showing that the talit shekulot techelet is an actual concept, shekulat techelet, I should say, right, is an actual concept in rabbinic literature, right? So we have, first of all, in source 3, you can look at in Midrash Tanaim, to Deuteronomy, to Devarim, we talk about, right, this is talking about the law of the king. His heart shall not rise above his brothers. We're talking about the king. He should not say, right? The king shouldn't say, I'm going to make a talit fully of techelet. And for tefillin, I'm going to make it entirely of gold. This is how the Midrash, and this is probably a Tannaitic Midrash, which is earlier, right? They use this concept of a talit shekulat techelet as an expression of haughtiness, arrogance in the law. I am the most observant, right? I'm going to be the best. I'm going to have the best religious products that I can. No, the Torah says you're not supposed to do that, right? The Midrash says. And again, in the Bavli, the talit shekulat techelet actually becomes a halakhic concept. I don't want to actually go so deeply into the halakhic discussion, but it asks, right, this is talking about tzitzit, which strings do you have to do first, the white ones or the blue ones, right? And it says that it's, the white ones, but it's okay if you do the blue ones first, right? And it actually offers a case in which a techelet, right, a talit shekulat techelet, right, a garment that is fully blue. What's the case, right? What's the case there? Do we need to put the white first, the blue first? And they actually have a conversation around that. Now, this case does not appear in the Yerushalmi. In the Yerushalmi, we only have this concept as an agadic concept, as a narrative or moral didactic concept. Only in the Bavli do we have it as a halakhic concept. Any suggestions to why that is? It's a good question. So think about it. If you have any ideas, you could let me know. I think, first of all, part of it is because the Yerushalmi does not have a Talmud on Kodashim, right? So that is just already from the get-go. It might have had it, but it just doesn't. On the other hand, the Bavli is known to be sort of obsessed with abstractions and every possible case, every theoretical and hypothetical case. So Korach, actually, as a rabbi, fits in pretty well to the culture of the Talmud Bavli. And I think that seeing it in context as an actual halachic discussion, lends some insight into Korach's own questions. I'm sure he wasn't aware of this halachic discussion, right? Although maybe the rabbis thought he was. But it does paint Korach in this picture of he is just a wise guy rabbi, right? He fits in with the sages of the Talmud Bavli. And I want to make one more suggestion to this picture of the techelet shekulat, of the talit shekulat techelet, right? This blue, fully blue garment, first of all, techelet might be blue, might be something like purple, might have been visually something that the rabbis were familiar with, living amongst a Roman environment where the color of royalty, does anybody know? was purple. And there were strict laws about who can actually wear purple, like fully purple togas. And the rabbis are very aware of that. They saw that around them in lots of different mosaics. And even the Jews themselves kind of adopted this idea about royalty. We have one mosaic from the very famous Dur Europa synagogue, which is 3rd century synagogue in Syria. And this is an image, a mosaic of Shemuel anointing David, right? Samuel anointing David. And what is David wearing? A fully purple toga, essentially. This is a visual concept that they had. There's this idea of a fully purple or blue something robe that brings to mind royalty, monarchy, elitism. And now that also makes a comment. The Midrash then is actually, I would say, satiricizing Korach. Because what's Korach's claim? We are all holy. Let's democratize holiness. And what are we going to do? We're going to wrap ourselves in the elitism, right? We're going to wrap ourselves in the clothing of the monarchy. We're going to wrap ourselves in the clothing of the 1%, right? You're not really for democracy, the Midrash is saying. You are subverting it for your own ends. You are just interested in power for yourself. And the Midrash tries to express that through this visual image of Korach, wrapping himself and his people in this blue or purple garment. Now, I want to just look at one more section before we open it up to questions, comments, and that is about the Bnei Korach, and we talked about that a little bit already. But as someone pointed out, right, in Bamidbar, in a few chapters, we're going to have a list of the sons of the Leviim, right? And it has this little interjection while it's going through the sons of Kehat, and it tells us, "V'titach ha'aretz et piha, v'tivla otam, ve'et Korach, b'mot ha'eda, ba'achot ha'esh, et chamishim u'matayim ish, v'yu laneh." This is still very ambiguous, right? The earth opened its mouth, swallowed them up with Korach, with the Edah, when the Bain died, in the consumption of the fire, 250 men. The Peshat is really not clear how Korach died. Did he die by fire? Did he die in the earth? The Midrashim say that he died by both, which I didn't bring. But of course, they're also trying to figure it out. And he gets both punishments. Ubnei Korach lo metu, and the sons of Korach did not die. In context, in the Peshat, what does that mean that they didn't die? Probably that they did not die in that way, right? The Midrashim, however, take that to mean they never died. They're always alive. In the Peshat, it probably signifies that they didn't die in that way. Maybe they weren't part of Korach's rebellion. Now we have that pasuk, right? So I'm thinking, what do the rabbis have before them? Literally, probably open on scrolls. When you don't have a physical book, you don't have to flip back and forth. It's not as hard. You just have different scrolls open in front of you. And they also have Divrei Hayamim, which was also mentioned, right? And in Divrei Hayamim, we are told that these are the Misharetim Lifnei HaMishkan Ohel Moed Bashir. These are the ones who are servicing the Ohel Moed, the Mishkan, with song. And it goes through an entire lineage, and it connects in that lineage Shemuel with Korach. As a descendant of Korach. This, for the rabbis, they're looking at this and they're probably a little bit confused. So they need to kind of figure out how to put all of these things together. The sons of Korach didn't die. There's some sort of connection of Shemuel with Korach. So what do we do with all this information? So here's one example of what they do. Also from the Tanhuma. ובני קורח לא מתו, תנא משום רבנו, מקום נתפצה בגהנם וישבו עליו. Right? A place was set aside in Gehenna, in the underworld, or something of the sort, where they sat and maybe sang songs. We'll see that in the next one. And then we have this really interesting story that's quoted in Masachet Sanhedrin as well. Right, one time we were traveling on the road, I'll just read it in English, and a certain Arab merchant said to me, "Come, I'm going to show you Korach," right? And I went, and there was this weird sort of ceremony, which we'll leave off for another time. And what do they hear coming from the ground? Let's find it in the text. Moshe emet v'torato emet v'hen bada'in, right? Moshe is true and his Torah is true, and they are liars, right? Korach and his community. But in the future, the Midrash continues. In the future, let's see, right? God is going to take them out. Right? Again, we have that connection to Hana. The Lord brings death and gives life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. So this takes it to the next level. There's a sense we're connecting the singing, we're connecting the sons of Korach being underground in some capacity, and we have to show some sort of redemption or some sort of repentance, and that's also what the Midrash is showing. They recognize their falsehood, their wrongdoing, and they say it for eternity, right? And the Bavli also continues with this in a few places, one of which is in Megillah, Masechet Megillah. It talks about this first pasuk in Shemuel, right, talking about Elkanah, Vayhi ish echad min haramatayim sofim, and they talk about, right, what is the interpretation of this verse? First, they use it for something else, but then they offer something. Then they offer a new one. Rabbi Chanina amar, Adam haba mibnei Adam she'omdim beromo shel olam. Right, someone who descends from people who stood at the height of the world. Who are these people who stood at the height of the world? The sons of Korach, right? Because it says the sons of Korach did not die. And with regard to them, it says, right, they had a special place in Gehenna, and from there they stood, and the other version, the parallel version says, and they sung songs. Here again, we have this Midrashic motif of the sons of Korach having a special place in Gehenna and singing songs from that. Are these the Tehillim, right? Are these the Mizmorei Tehillim? It seems like that's what the rabbis are imagining. And we'll just end with one more from Bereshit Rabbah, which is probably the earliest of all the sources that we looked at. Bereshit Rabbah and the Yerushalmi are around the same time. The rabbi said, "V'Rabbanan amre, kach hayta adato shel Korach, shoka'at veyoredet, ad she'amda Chana v'nitpalela alehem, Hashem emitu mechayem morid sha'ol v'ya'al." Right? The congregation of Korach were sinking and sinking until Chana stood up and prayed on their behalf, and then they stopped sinking. So it seems like this idea of Korach and his Edah connected to Chana and being almost redeemed by Chana was a very ancient idea that already existed in Bereshit Rabbah, and it gets exacerbated, it gets drawn out and fleshed out in a lot of the later Midrashim. So I just want to kind of wrap up everything that we're talking about, and then I'll open this up for questions and comments. But what we've seen throughout these texts is that the rabbis are trying to understand who Korach is based on the Pesukim that we have, based on the very little information that we know about him. Well, they kind of rabbinicize him to give him a little bit of credibility, but also to kind of make fun of him, right, with the talit and looking at him in light of the Roman imagery of a blue or purple garment, and to maybe even ask their own questions about the validity of law, the validity of laws that might not have been straight from God. The rabbis are asking their own questions. And they have to figure out, how are we going to make the sons of Korach be the authors of Tehillim? How do we do that? Well, we're going to redeem them. Through whom? Through Hana. Her singing and their singing, right, redeems these people. So the Midrashim are, right, on the one hand, it might seem like they're making up these interesting stories, these fun stories, right, what's going on? But the Midrashim are reading the text closely, trying to give illustrative examples that demonstrate the real question of Korach, Kulam Kedoshim, right? They use this imagery to flesh that out further in a way that would be relevant to the authors and the audience of rabbinic texts. We are people who are engaged in the law, we are engaged in interpretation, and we need to figure out, how do we make that make sense? And Korach is one of the vehicles that does that for them. I'm going to pause here. Any questions or comments?
Thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, comments, they can raise their hand, unmute, write in the chat box. I'll build off of Sam wrote in the chat box. He was responding to the question of what is his claims? He was asking, is he questioning Moshe's nevuah? And I think that there's this tension over here of the veracity of Moshe's prophecy and the Torah. And there is a pasuk which adds, makes this a little bit more complicated when we say ubecha ya'aminu le'olam. When they accepted the Torah, Hashem is me'id, confirms and says, listen, in your nevuah and your veracity, you will have throughout all the generations they'll believe in you. So then, what is this tension happening over here? Is Korach actually the one he was in the generation that accepted the Torah? So then, what is his claim?
Good. What is he questioning with this in terms of Moshe's nevuah? Do you want to offer a suggestion?
I don't have an answer. I think it's a good question.
No, you don't have an answer.
You can answer it.
It's a very good question. I think that time and time again, the rabbis are expressing sort of, we find this in other Midrashim as well, at the same time, simultaneous validation of Moshe's nevuah and also a little bit of questioning. There's always going to be those two sides. Anytime you validate something, it also opens the door for questioning, like, oh, why do we need to mention it? Why do we need to validate it? Is there something that we should be worried about or consider, or questioning? So I think that that's what the rabbis are saying happened. You're right, in Moshe's own generation. It's interesting that they don't put that on the other rebel rousers, right? It's not the Tan and Aviram. It's not the other, not really the 250. It's just Korach's question. And that, requires a little bit more thought, which I think, it makes sense within everything we've been talking about. But they have a specific interest in him in particular, probably because of where he comes from Livy. Great.
Maybe you can also touch on the opening question that we started with is, what did they take? And that's really the opening problem for Chazal, which sort of sparks all of this.
Yeah.
So we're not saying that this is the interpretation they're suggesting for that. Like, what is the actual pasuk trying to say in Pshat? What is the subject?
Yeah, what is the subject? The rabbis are not trying to answer, right? We have a distinction of Midrash and Peshat. The rabbis did not have that distinction. That's really important to remember when we read Midrash. The rabbis did not think that what they're doing is called Midrash, right? They thought we're just reading the text. So that, first of all, is important to remember. In the Peshat, right, what are they taking? It could be that the text, left out the object because it's trying to say that they took a whole bunch of different things. They took a whole bunch of people and combined them together, right? The Midrash, however, uses that to talk about, right, that they took, that it was his heart that was taken in a certain way. They use it to kind of draw out a didactic lesson, a message from that. But the rabbis, but I think that they probably felt like that was Peshat, right? They didn't have that dichotomy. They just felt like that is what the text is saying. It's his heart that's taking him, right?
Interesting. I think so. So, meaning when they speak out that this entire narrative of he made a feast and he asked the three questions, it's hard to hear that they actually thought that this was the Peshat.
No, so it's a very right. So I don't think that's what I'm saying. I don't think that they felt like this actually happened, but it's a modern medieval concept, Peshat and Didash. They didn't have that. They didn't have that distinction. I don't think that means that they thought that what they're saying is Peshat. They felt like it's true in some sort of way, true not in historical veracity, right? There's some other kind of truth to Midrash. The stories that they're telling might have been traditions, might have been passed down. I don't know if they thought it actually happened. I don't think so, but they didn't look at it in the lens of Peshat versus Didash. They felt like this is true because it tells a true lesson. It doesn't matter if it didn't happen. Very different, pre-modern way of thinking about text. We don't have, you have to reorient yourself to thinking along those lines.
Interesting. Anyone else? Questions?
Midrash is,
Mm-hmm.
was just going to say, Midrash is a way of reading for the rabbis. It's not as much a way of, adding stories. This is the lens that they use to read Torah, to read Chumash, and all the books of Tanakh, right? They view everything in one world. All Pesukim from all the different books are sort of combined in one kind of sphere. To them is truth. They didn't think that they were doing something different. Oftentimes it is very radical, but I don't think that they thought that they were doing something so radical.
That's fascinating, because we never, in this modern day, we don't think about it as their lens was like unified. Like we really do have that dichotomy, and there's a lot of like debates, on different sides of that. So that's good to know that they just had like their interpretation, and you said it was their truth, whether or not it was historically accurate, which I'm sure we could learn so many lessons from. So that's nice.
Yeah, I think the whole concept of truth is like, the way we look at it as historically accurate and and verifiable, right? That's not how they looked at truth. That's not how the ancient world looked at truth. That's a very modern way of looking at truth. So for
Like
them,
they didn't have history textbooks that children learned in school, in 1896 this happened and like that, dates and people.
no, the Greek historians, the way that they wrote their history, we would never call that history today. The fathers of history wrote essentially op-eds. They wrote that's how they wrote
Right,
history.
myths
They wrote
and
the way that
legends
they
and
interpreted
stories.
history.
Right,
Yeah.
it was more stories.
Yeah.
So Vayikach doesn't have any literal Peshat meaning to it, as far as we know.
Meaning, like, you're saying what is the object of the Vayikach?
Yes, you said the heart, which sounds very figurative to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, I probably, on the most basic level, the text is just omitting because Korach is sort of taking everybody all together, right? All the people that come next are probably both the object and the subject of what's coming. So I think that's maybe how the Torah is grammatically using it to indicate both of those things.
Okay, thank you. I could go with that. I liked
We have though like Onkelos already around then, providing like a model of Peshat, right? Like he
Yeah.
isn't his purpose is really to give some sort of translation and basic explanation without inserting additional narratives.
Yeah.
But maybe that's very
and
like
what is Onkelos doing? He's translating. That's a very different project than what the rabbis are doing. So that's probably why he's not viewing it as interpreting, reading, right? The rabbis are not translating. They are they're interpreting. Yeah.
right. So you could argue like even they wouldn't have had that dichotomy, but he was like, well, I'm going to do a text which is Peshat without maybe calling it that. But
they had Targum. For sure they had Targum. Targum was a category, like in the ancient world for the rabbis. And in their synagogues, assuming that they were part of synagogues, they definitely read the Targum in the synagogues. So that was for sure a category. Like if you wanted Peshat, you listened to the Targum, right?
Targum, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Very interesting.
I'll stop the share.
Any final questions, comments, severe criticisms? No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so we are going to close it for tonight. Thank you so much, Miriam, for being with us. It was a real privilege to have you. Hopefully, more times going forward. Thank you, everyone, for being here live and for all of your great questions and comments. And is there any way, maybe email, that people can be in touch with you? Does they have any further questions?
Sure, yeah. Let me put my email in the chat. Okay.
Amazing.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. That's all, everyone.